There we go. So let's have a look at Kubla Khan and realize how it breaks from the ideas presented in the Blake poem to a construction of a fantasy, and in many ways a Gothic themed poem that is bathed in desire, which is also part of the romantic experience. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. So in this magical location, we are brought to something that predates time and creates, in some ways, a romantic fetish of the material presented to us. We end up merging down a romantic chasm. The moon is there, and a woman wailing for her demon lover is there. And we ask ourselves, what is this poem about? Is it about the desire and fetishization or almost eroticization of what this woman is wailing for that exists within the poem? Or is it a way of looking at the landscape that surrounds the desires of this woman? We can never know. I'll continue reading from the poem a few lines down. Huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chafy grain beneath the thresher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momentarily the sacred river, 5 miles meandering with amazing motion. Through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man. In other words, we're going to this place, we're being taken down this journey somewhere that lies outside of our reality, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesizing war. So we've really left the everyday, the shadow of the dome of pleasure, right? This is what this poem is about. Floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain of the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Tabora. So the poem leaves the tangibility of the landscape it creates to embody these desires of its two characters who aren't really the speakers within the poem. I remember when my brother studied this poem at Dawson, and he said, I'm sure they were all really high when they wrote this. And there is some speculation, of course, of the levels of inebriation of the poets as they constructed these magical, almost crazed images for us. But where Blake reconstructs London of the time to expose the dangers and horrors that the poor classes experienced, Coleridge leaves that completely. And he creates a seduction poem, a desire poem, a lovish poem. And instead, there's a certain level of almost sexual fetish that exists within this poem. And it's in this way that I think in many ways, Coleridge creates a poem that embodies the sublime about 150%. In other words, the poet speaker appears so overwhelmed by what, we're going to presume it's a he, as Coleridge was male, by what he sees in the poem. Does the poem thus make sense? Or does the poem function as a kind of artistic vision? I think in many ways the poem is art, and there's almost a desire, we can think about what we understand as modern art, right? And we've been somewhere where we see the desire of the painter, but we have really no idea what the painting's about. And I think this is really what happens with Coleridge. The fascination or the journey that we take, because as part of it is clear, this journey to this kind of celestial netherworld is thwarted by the questionable desire of the characters. This Abyssinian maid, the wailing woman. Who is she and who is she seducing? And then at the end of the poem, the milk of paradise is consumed. So what does that mean? Obviously, it's the desire that the sublime has embraced a level of pleasure that can't really be understood without the highly constructed poetic realities and structures within the poem. Does the sublime work? I've always found the sublime the hardest. I think the class consciousness in Blake is far easier than the sublime we look at. And what you'll notice as well is that the representation of the sublime in the Coleridge poem is far harder to understand than what we will experience in response to Neoplatonism, which I'll talk about after the break. So when we look at Kubla Khan, it was written in 1798, but not published until 1816, right? So even though this is an earlier romantic, I think the subject matter really pushes it a little further, and it's almost like the world wouldn't have been ready for it. Coleridge, in the subtitle that I read to you before I read, it describes the poem as a fragment or a dream. The speculation is that he was under the influence of opium when he wrote this. Kubla Khan is often seen as a brilliant achievement for supernatural poetry, but it's often a harder poem to hold together because where the imagery is clear, or the journey that the imagery brings us on, right? Imagery, symbolism, all kinds of very clear landmarks that take us to this mythical setting, the story lying within the poem isn't. So the poem starts with the mythical city of Xanadu and the sacred river called Alph or Alpha. We end up in gardens where we arrive at in a zigzaggy manner. And there's this chasm that we're supposed to understand is wonderful. But I know for myself as a reader, I feel a little left out by this poem. But the landscape itself was visited by both, I guess, what would have been understood as fairies of the time and demons. And there's almost a medieval-like tale here where love and romance take place. We've got the moon, we've got the woman, she's sad for her lover, we've got the stones that are thrown up and falling in every direction. And there's, of course, the warning of an approaching war and danger. In the second part of the poem, where Coleridge moves on to discuss the pleasure dome and its shadow floated midway on the waves, there's music, there's fountains, bright with sunlight, but caves of ice. And it's almost as if the imagery becomes too loaded. The poet tells the reader or readers in this, and there's an eroticization of an Abyssinian maid who's playing upon her instrument. And there's symphony and song. So it's almost as if what Coleridge can't get across in tangible words, he gets across in reference to setting and implied music. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it generally in response to the criticism of understanding the poem, it's the poet himself who constructs the poem because he has fed on the honeydew and drunk the milk of paradise. So the strength of this poem is its dreamlike faculty, right? We could think about when we dream and record them and we have to tell our dreams and nothing makes sense. There's definitely that here. And there is a desire to create almost a sleeping state where the speaker narrator imagines or tries to understand what he's seeing and then awakes only to have a kind of distant recollection, and thus the poem ends. The poem, I think this is how come it's coined a fragment. It doesn't, so a fragment is a piece of, it doesn't have any logical consistency of ideas. Instead, it's got incredible imagery, haunting language, but it contains no precise story, no moral, and no allegory. And the words that we detect as symbolism, we can only get so far in decoding, as you'll notice. So I'm going to end my recording now, and I'm going to